We're up with Paula next. And Paula, you're going to be talking to us about liquidation preferences and voting rights. So Damien's gone over a little bit of your territory, and I see that you're going to be talking a little bit about conversion and such, which is a little bit of the territory for Gary and Dion. So you guys are kind of overlapping some today. I'll just ask that as much as possible you stay within your lanes. Got to go too deeply.
Yeah, I touched on that, but it's not too deep.
Cool. Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, Paula.
Hi, everyone. You're welcome. My name is Paula. I'm going to talk about liquidation preference and voting rights. If you have any questions, just jump in and interrupt me, or you can ask me questions at the end. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two basic concepts before I talk about liquidation preference, and one is preferred stock, and that's basically what startup investors receive, and then we have common stock, that it's basically what startup employees receive. It represents a shareholder ownership of a corporation, and it's an investor in common stock expects to participate in the growth of a company through higher stock prices and or dividends. And then I'm gonna dive a little more deep into preferred stock. Preferred stock comes with special rights, including liquidation preferences. It has bond-like features. It pays a high dividend that is similar to a bond yield. Preferred stock the investors don't participate in the earnings of a company. It just pays out the remain fixed. And investors also get paid first ahead of other holders of other cases of stock in a liquidation event. Why this happens? Because investors take larger risks by providing startups with significant capital. So I'm going to talk more about liquidation preference, right? What is a liquidation preference? Liquidation preference is an investor right that guarantees the return of investor capital before any other distributions are made to common shareholders. And just to be clear, this not only happens when there's dissolution or bankruptcy of the company, but it can also be the sale of the company or the merge with another company. And they are typically set at 1 times capital invested, but they can go as high as 2 times, 3 times, or 4 times, depending on how desperate the founder of the company's of capital. So are all liquidation preference the same? Oh, wait, just one more note on that. Liquidation preferences are a non-factor if a company exists via IPO. And then, okay, let's talk about the 3 different types of liquidation preferences. The first one is participating liquidation preferences, and it's also called the double V preferred. This one is most favorable to investors, and this means that investors will be paid back their liquidation preference, and they will also receive additional participation in the remaining proceeds in proportion to their ownership. And then we have non-participating liquidation preferences that are also called straight preferences. This one's investors will get back their initial investment plus all the unpaid dividends that might have accrued over the lifetime of the relationship. And the last one is capped liquidation preferences, also called partially participating preferred. This is favorable to both investors and companies. It operates basically the same as participating liquidation preference, but this one, there is a limit to the total amount of money that the investor can make per share. And I'm gonna give a few examples. I used 2 times in the first 2 and 4 times in the last one. So, okay, the first example is participating liquidation preferences. let's say the investor puts 1 million into a company with a multiple of 2 times. So the investor, is also entitled to 5 million as a part of their balance sale of the company. And at the end, they receive their 5 million of the balance sale of the company plus their 2 million of investment back, and they get a total of 7 million. For the non-participating liquidation preferences, let's say again, the investor puts 1 million into a company with a multiple of 2, and they will just receive their 2 million. If there are any dividends, they will get them. If they're not, they will just get back their 2 million. And then my last one, that is cap liquidation preferences. Investors will put 1 million. Let's say this one is with a multiple of 4x. Plus a limit to the total amount of money they can make per share. So let's say they're gonna stop being paid once their return on investment is equal to 5 million. So they're gonna get their 4 million plus 1 more million, but they cannot get more than that. And then, so all these examples are, with just one round of investors, but there's another concept called seniority, and this is what most of the companies use, because as they do rounds, they go from round A to round C or D or even higher. So how our investors are going to get paid if they're different rounds, right? So we have standard seniority, and this one is basically liquidation preferences are on or in reverse order from the latest round to the earliest round. And that means that if there are 3 rounds, round C gets paid first, and they have to get paid their total amount of their investment, and then they move to B, and then they move to A. And then, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, but this is pari passu seniority. And this one, it's all preferred investors equal seniority status, and this means that all investors get paid the same amount. And peer seniority, this is something that, let's say, SpaceX will do, because I think they did like seven rounds of investment. So what they did is that they grouped investors from different founding groups, and let's say investors 7 and 6 were grouped together, and once the different founding groups were grouped together, and within the group they use the pari passu seniority. And then, can I convert preferred stocks to common stocks? Yes. Preferred stockholders can negotiate certain items that will allow them to convert preferred stock into common stock. Why? Just to make profit. If an investor sees that a company's doing really good, they want to basically convert their preferred stock to common stock. Okay, let's go ahead with an example. Let's say company X, Y, and Z issues convertible preferred shares at $100 each with a conversion ratio of 6.5. Shareholders can convert 1 preferred share into 6.5 common shares. That is by doing 100 divided by 6.5, and we get 15.38. The common stock must reach the price to make the conversion profitable. Conversion premium is a percentage. Conversion premium percentage is the difference between parity and conversion values divided by 100. And lastly, I am going to talk about shareholder rights. Okay, shareholder rights, and this is basically for all the common shareholders. They possess the right to share in the company's profitability and gains from its stock price appreciation. And I have 4 here. I have 4 in my screen, but I have 5 rights that I want to talk about. Let's say the most important rights that all common share include the right to share in the company's profitability, income, and assets, and then a degree of control and influence over the company's management selection, general meeting voting rights, preemptive rights, and preemptive rights just basically gives the shareholder the right to buy additional shares. And that's it. Do you have any questions? Here are my references.
Yeah,
Well,
I think I
let's go
should
ahead.
jump in here. Yeah, sorry, Chris. I think I should just jump in here. I'm the discussant for today.
Hi.
Just before anyone jumps in or anything, thank you so much for that presentation. It was actually really good. And I subsequently have a few questions of my own that I'd like to jump in with. So do common stockholders get their money back in the event of liquidation, or how does that work?
Yeah, so basically, common. I'm not sure about that. Can Rick help me with this one?
Well, I can. So in the event of liquidation, liquidation might be because there's an exit. Maybe we've sold the company to others in a buyout, or maybe it's the company's gone under or whatever. So but money's about to change hands for the remaining value of the asset. So the investors that have seniority or preference will get their contractually obligated amounts out first, and then anything that is left, once that is all done, then is proportionately split up amongst the common shareholders, assuming that there's only one class of common. If there's multiple classes of common, there may be even some tiers in that. But that tells us the good news and the bad news for a common shareholder. And it's why the common shareholder's price per share is more volatile than a preferred price per share. Because the common shareholders might end up splitting a very small pot, or the common shareholders may end up splitting a pot that's worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars.
Got it. Okay. And speaking of tiers, what is the most common form of that seniority liquidation preference that you were talking about just before? Do you know what the most common one is?
Yeah, well, I read a few articles online, and the most common is tiered seniority, because so most of the companies not only do one round or two rounds, but they do several, right? So they use tiered seniority. As I say,
okay.
SpaceX used tiered seniority.
Right. And so just after that, I think you talked about the conversion of preferred to common stock. Is there do you know if there's a favorable time you should do that, like at the beginning of an IPO or a different point in time, or is it a totally subjective thing that the preferred stockholder can do whenever they feel like doing?
Yeah. So what I understand is that it can be done, like if the company is doing pretty well and the investor sees that, they can totally convert it, but I might be wrong. Does anyone else have a different approach to this question?
Jens, I think you've seen some of this, and Victor, I think you may have as well. Would you like to pipe in here?
Yeah, maybe Victor can go first.
So, sorry, I didn't hear the question. Can you repeat it?
So is there a preferred time to convert from preferred stock to common stock? Is it like during an IPO, for example, or at a different point in time, or is it totally subjective based on the preferred stockholders' position and whatever they want to do?
So it's mostly subjected to the contract that you have established. So we had some convertible debt issued from our company, and what we had on our agreement was that it was the maturity of the contract, but for 2 years, and through that time, even though we raised some cash, the percentage that we were going to give to the investor didn't change. So we were diluting that from our own shares, even though we were selling shares to investors during that time. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but that sort of, we had the conversion rate agreed upon when we made that agreement, and it held for that 2 years. Even though the value of the company went up, we still had the conversion rate at the same.
Right. So what you're saying is basically the time at which you change from preferred to common is contractually obligated.
Yeah.
Okay. And sorry, just last one. I know it's kind of selfish. Are there, Pale, I think this one's for you. Are there votes per share dictated by each share purchase, or are there a class of share that dictates how many votes per share you get, or is it something completely different?
Well, think about this for a moment. And Jens, I'd like you to kind of pipe in here if you would as well. But think about this. As we just saw with the conversation about conversion, we'll look at that with voting rights as well. It's all based upon what's agreed on in the contract. I mean, we have Mr. Zuckerberg, who is the primary shareholder of a particular class of common stock with Facebook, which common stock holds voting rights. The other types of common stock that have been issued by Facebook hold no voting rights. So Zuckerberg, who's got a vast minority of the ownership of the company at this point, if you look at the entirety of it, Zuckerberg controls virtually the voting rights of the company, even though he owns a tiny percentage. So it's all based upon the contract. It's not based upon percentage ownership. It's all based upon the contract, which starts with that term sheet. And that dictates everything else.
Okay, so it's not like if I invest a lot of money, then I have the most right over the company. It's just based over my contract.
Yeah, right? So if you invest a lot of money and we're a good enough negotiator to have that investment be accompanied by voting preference and voting rights and a majority interest or veto power or whatever, then yeah, you got some pretty good control. But if you weren't that good at negotiating, or maybe you're not that savvy, or the attorney you've used or banker you've used to help you with this isn't that savvy, you may end up investing 99% of the capital of the company and have zero control. When I tell you that the only things you cannot include in these contracts are things that are illegal and things that are constitutionally guaranteed, I'm not kidding. Anything else goes.
Right. Okay. So sorry, I've hogged up the questions here, but does anyone else have any questions for Paolo or Rick or anyone else here?
I can add something to what Rick just said. You see this in Facebook, of course, but you also saw it in Google in the early days when they did their IPO. They wrote a long document that was included in their S1, where they explained that if you want to own Google shares, you also agree that Sergey and Larry, the founders of the company, dictates the strategy and everything. So they had Google A and B shares. So you see this with more and more technology companies, that they split the shares in two. The A shares normally have dual voting right. It means that every share counts as two votes, whereas B only has one, or even less. So it just shifts the control to the founders, even though they don't own any more of the company. So if you have a chance, go back to the S1 of Google. It's actually a pretty interesting read.
Thank you.
So Paolo, let's go back and talk a little bit more about this seniority issue for a moment. I'll stay on the slide you were on. So
okay, great.
Would suggest that the person or people with the last money invested get their money out first. So here we are, and let's say you and Gary and Marco and I, or Zane and I, are the investors. And Zane invested first, and then Gary, and then you, and then me. Why is it that I'm the one that's going to be allowed to get my money out first? I mean, Zane's been in here the longest. Shouldn't he be able to get his money out first? Any ideas, guys?
I have no idea, but is it tied to the amount of money that you invest? Because you're taking a bigger risk than...
It's typically not tied to the amount.
Okay.
What governs the seniority here? Is this just kind of common knowledge, or is there something that governs this?
Would it be the term sheet or the structured contract?
It'd be back to the contract once again. And the intuition here is, if I knew that Zane was allowed to get his money out first, I would never put my money in. So,
Right.
so it's going to be structured, perhaps, if the standard seniority used, it's going to be structured that way because of the recognition that a new investor capital, which may be very important, in fact, it may be life-saving to the company, new investor capital may not be available without that kind of an agreement.
But Rick, doesn't that kind of structuring make people like more nervous to invest first because they know they're less likely to get the most return on their investment in the event of liquidation? Doesn't that make people more nervous to invest first?
Yeah. That's why they expect a lot for those early stage investments. But you're exactly right. It increases the risk component, right? Now there are
that means in a standard seniority contract, your liquidation preference would be far higher. Like at that time of investment, your liquidation preference would be a multiple far higher, like in Series A, than it would be in Series B, C, D, or E.
If that's the way the series of common shares were designated.
Got it.
Anything else that you guys want to add to or reference with respect to this?
Can I ask you a question, Rick, on behalf of the class?
Sure.
So we just, from the example you just mentioned with the seniority, that you can come in last and you can get more seniority than the previous investors. Wouldn't it be messy for the capitalization table and also for the founders/operators to have different terms for different investors?
So Jens just introduced a term here that I think might be discussed a little bit by Gary and Dion in a few minutes, and that's cap table or capitalization table, which is simply the matrix that holds all this data. It's the table that holds all this data to help us know who's in first, how much they came in at, what the day was, the amounts, all this kind of thing. So they may talk to us a little bit more about that. But the cap tables are structured then typically with this concept of seniority and liquidation preference in mind. I mean, they don't exclusively do that. And in fact, it makes it very messy, Jens. But once again, we have these contracts which lay the groundwork for our attorneys to have the arguments over which they're going to send us bills.
Exactly. But if you're the founder or operator, you end up quickly in the next capital event, you can end up in a mess because no one knows who owns how much of the company. And then you're going to get even larger legal bills.
Right. But if you think about this, one of the responsibilities of the board of directors, and I think Katie's going to talk to us about the board before we're done here, but one of the responsibilities of the board is to authorize these capital transactions. The CEO alone can't do this. It's got to be the board that does this. The founder alone can't do it unless the founder controls the board. So if you think about it, if we're about to accept Alex's investment in the company, and Alex has required that he gets his money out first if and when a liquidation takes place, we as the board, which are representing the stakeholders, and we probably are the stakeholders, we've agreed to it. Otherwise, Alex's money doesn't come in. And so, yeah, it can be a mess. If you're ever in a position where you have your own company or you're investing in a company, what you want to do is make sure that everything is spelled out as clearly as possible. And not just clearly to you. This is where the concept of does it make sense to a fifth grader comes into play, I think. You want it spelled out clearly so that the lowest common denominator of intellect in the scenario understands all the jots and tittles. Otherwise, you simply will argue about it. And all these millions that you think you're about to use to buy your private island in the Bahamas are going to get held up in court for the next 3 years.